Hello everyone, in this video I'll walk you through my process in choosing a new amplifier for my home theater. We'll look at some key specs that manufacturers typically provide and some factors I think are important when choosing the right amplifier. Just sharing the process and some of the things that I've learned in case one of you are looking for an amplifier or soon will be. If nothing else, hopefully it's an interesting watch. A quick recap about why I need an amp. I mentioned in an earlier video I sold my Outlaw 5000. It was an earlier version that did not have the balanced connections. I'm going balanced now, so I need an amplifier with XLR connections. Initially, I planned to buy the Outlaw 5000X, which is the version that has the XLR connections. My old Outlaw did not disappoint. It was solid, no issues whatsoever, plenty of power, but because I need a new amp, I took this as an opportunity to explore other options. A few key specs that manufacturers typically provide: total harmonic distortion, or THD. This is usually presented as a percent that shows the change in output signal from the original input, essentially how much harmonic distortion has made its way into the signal. A lower percentage reflects a cleaner output signal. 1% is generally the max for a decent signal. Some amps go as low as hundreds and in some cases thousands of a percent. Signal to noise ratio, or SNR. This is a measure of the strength of the input signal relative to unwanted noise. It's expressed in decibels, and the higher the number, the clearer the output signal. For context, if an amp has a signal to noise ratio of 110, that means the unwanted signal is 110 decibels louder than the unwanted noise. 80 decibels is about the minimum for a good amplifier. Input sensitivity. This refers to the voltage needed from the input to drive the amplifier to its maximum output without clipping. Properly matching the amplifier's input sensitivity to the preamp's output voltage allows for the best possible performance of that amplifier. If your preamp is too high for the amplifier's input sensitivity, you can end up clipping and damaging your speakers. If the preamp is too low for the amplifier's input sensitivity, the amp won't reach its maximum output. Crosstalk. This is a measure of signal leakage between channels. It's expressed in decibels. The lower the number, the better. You don't want signals from individual channels interfering with other channels. That creates a noisy, muddy sound. Most amps should do a pretty good job with crosstalk. Negative 60 decibels is generally considered decent. Negative 80 decibels is good. Anything lower than negative 100 is excellent. Some factors that I feel are important to consider when amplifier shopping: the power handling of the speakers. It's especially important to know how much power a speaker can handle without causing damage. The headroom provided by a powerful amp is fine. It may not be worth it if it's power that can't be used without doing damage to the speaker. Ultimately, as long as you're mindful of the limitations of the speaker and not pushing them to extreme levels, all should be well. Speaker sensitivity. This is a measure of the amount of sound output produced from 1 watt power input from an amplifier at 1 meter. My Klipsch RP8000F has a sensitivity of 98 decibels. That means at 1 meter, my speaker can produce 98 decibels with 1 watt of power. I sit about 12 feet from the speaker, so rough calculation, I need only about 13 watts of power to produce 98 decibels at my main seat. So super efficient speakers. Generally, these won't require much power, but if I had speakers lower in sensitivity, say 88 decibels, to produce the same SPL of 98 decibels at 12 feet, the speaker would need a lot more power, 133 watts. That's just an example. 98 decibels is very loud. Ultimately, in considering an amp, it's vital to know the sensitivity of your speakers, understand your general listening volume and your listening position, because your power requirements could change exponentially depending on those factors. Now, you don't have to do a complex calculation to get an idea of what you need. Speakers with a sensitivity of 90 to 92 and above generally don't require a lot of power, so an amplifier with modest power output with maybe a little extra headroom for peace of mind should be plenty. Ultimately, again, you don't want to overspend for power you don't need. Speakers below 88, 87 decibels, especially if you're pushing it and listening at higher volume, will require much more power. They're going to demand it. So you'll need an amplifier with the power to handle those volumes, especially those volume peaks. The amps that I decided to look at include the OSD 4200 4-channel amp, the Outlaw 5000X 5-channel amplifier, the Buckeye NC252 MP 4-channel amplifier, and the Buckeye NC502 MP 4-channel amplifier. There are a lot of other options, but the OCD made my final list because it's a budget-friendly amplifier, the Outlaw because I had it before and I know what I'm getting. In my research, I learned more about Class D amplifiers, and that led me to the Buckeye amps. Very affordable, lots of power, very power efficient. I would consider another monolith, but they're out of stock with no restock date. I can't wait and hope for it to be available, so unfortunately the monolith will not be an option. The OSD is the lowest cost option at $649.99, followed by the Outlaw at $769. However, that does not include shipping, which is an extra $70 to $80. The Buckeye 252 is $925, and the Buckeye 502 is $1,125. The OSD has the highest continuous power measurement of all the amplifiers. In fact, it has the best cost per channel per watt of any of the amplifiers. I found the datasheet for the two Hypex modules, the 502 and the 252. The 502 is 100 watts continuous and the 252 is 50 watts continuous. Also, it looks like the Outlaw and OSD continuous power measurement was across the full bandwidth, whereas the Hypex may have been measured at 1000 hertz. I'm not entirely sure the measurements are apples to apples. The Monoprice monolith M8250X and M8125X has the exact same Hypex modules as the Buckeyes, respectively. They have a continuous measurement of 200 watts for their 8250 with the 502 module and 100 watts for the 8125 model with the 252 module. If 100 watts continuous is the minimum for the 502, it's plenty for my setup, especially if max output is 350 watts to cover the headroom. Calculating that out based on my speaker sensitivity of 98 decibels and my listening distance of 12 feet, at 100 watts, I can expect an SPL of just under 106.7 decibels. I don't listen to anything at 106.7 decibels, certainly not a continuous sound hovering at that level. Movie audio in particular is a series of peaks and valleys. I measured the SPL for a pretty hard-hitting demo-worthy scene in my home theater at my main seat at a volume level that I typically listen at, just on the very edge of really pushing it, and the highest peak SPL that I measured was 97 decibels. On occasion, I'll play a scene and really crank it, but I don't regularly listen at those extreme levels. 100 watts continuous plus 350 watts peak should be plenty of power for my needs, and based on the information and other reviews I found online, the 502 has the highest peak power at 1% total harmonic distortion at both 4 and 8 ohms respectively. If the Buckeyes have more power than I need, why consider either when the OSD and the Outlaw offer plenty of power at a lower price? Total harmonic distortion and signal to noise ratio favor both Buckeyes. Very low audible noise or distortion in their signal. Also superb signal separation. Crosstalk is among the best of any amp in any class at any price. For movie watching, the Outlaw and OSD should be just fine, but having a transparent, super clean signal is very appealing. Circling back to crosstalk, there are two modules in the 252 and 502. Each module will power 2 of the 4 channels. I was a bit concerned about different channels sharing the same module. Not a lot of clarity in the data sheet that I found about whether the crosstalk measurement for the Hypex modules is based on multiple channels on one module or multiple channels on different modules in the same unit. I'll assume it's based on some aggregate of all the channels. I could not find the crosstalk measurement for the OSD, so no figure there. The OSD and Outlaw are some big, heavy units compared to the much lighter and much more compact Buckeyes. The weight and dimensions are not a factor at all to me. I have plenty of space. And just out of curiosity, I pulled the specs for a 5-channel monolith. Again, they're not available with no restock date, so I can't consider it even if I wanted to, but it's a solid beast of an amp. And the Trinnov Amplitude 8M at $9,500. Class D amp. Excellent specs on paper, not vastly different than the Buckeye or even the Monolith. Perhaps there's some other magic going on that's not on paper to justify that price. Not sure, not at all judging, but a hefty price. All of the amplifiers are very appealing in different ways. The OSD is an impressive budget amplifier. There's a familiarity with the Outlaw that gives me some confidence in its performance. The Buckeyes are as clean and transparent as any amplifier and should be able to not just hit those peaks without clipping, but sustain those levels and not give out in any of those big, loud action scenes. That's a look at some of the amps I considered and my thoughts about each. Hopefully this has been informative or at least entertaining in some way. I've made my decision, and when it delivers, I'll share that in a full review on the channel.